everyone, and welcome to the Talk They Hear You podcast. What Parents Are Saying, Prevention Wisdom, Authenticity, and Empowerment. I'm Debbie Burnt, Director of Parent Movement 2.0, and I'll be your host. We are honored and thrilled today to have former Congressman Patrick Kennedy and his amazing wife, Amy Kennedy, talking with us. Welcome, you two.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. So we're excited to get to talk to you about parenting through topics that we cover, which are underage substance use and mental health. And let me just tell our listeners a little bit about your background, how well grounded you are in these topics. You both recently co-founded the Kennedy Forum, which is leading a national dialogue on transforming mental health and addiction care in the United States. In addition to co-founding this forum, Ms. Kennedy is its education director and is a proponent of creating systems within our schools that intervene early and meet kids where they are for improved health outcomes of all kinds. Former Congressman Kennedy has been working on this national dialogue around mental health and addiction since 2008, when he was the primary author of something called HR 1428, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Act. He has sat on presidential commissions on this topic, and around the same time, he stepped into long-term recovery himself and is an author of a book on the topic as well. In addition to all of this, they are also the parents of 5 children. So they are truly some of the most qualified people we could be talking with today about this subject. So welcome and thank you. Tell us real quick, we always ask all our guests, what are the ages of your kids? So we just know where you are in the parenting spectrum, and then let's dive in on this important topic.
Sure. So we do have 5 kids. I don't know if that makes us an expert because we haven't seen how it all is going to roll out. We're still really in the thick of it with our oldest at 15. Our next is 11. We have a daughter who's 9 and a 7-year-old as well as a 4-year-old. So,
oh my gosh.
15.
That's amazing. Really exciting times. So let's just start by maybe talking a little bit about recovery, about addiction, and what is it like to be parenting from recovery and or having that topic in your family's life?
Well, I am fortunate for me that a person in long-term recovery, which for those of us, our sobriety dates are permanent, which means we don't change them. For me, that's February 22nd, 2011. I had been in and out of recovery all of my life, first coming into rehab at 17 years old, and then ultimately not getting a permanent sobriety date till I was 42. The tragedy today, and the reason why this podcast is so important, is that I relapsed so many times, which is not uncommon for people with these illnesses. They are relapsing chronic illnesses. The challenge we have today is that the strength of these synthetic drugs that are on the streets mean that when you relapse, you die. Point in fact, we don't have the 9 lives that we used to in recovery. It's why we're seeing death rates skyrocket and why I see my fellows in 12-step recovery dying every day, because when they relapse, they go out, they use what's on the street. That's often cut with things that they're not familiar with, new fentanyl analogs and other things. And all of that's coupled with a society that is looking the other way on addiction industries. We all know we all faced tobacco and alcohol and so forth while we were growing up. But today we have technology addiction, and then you've got this new commercialization of marijuana. And it's really hard for us to imagine how kids walk that gauntlet, because we're a society with epidemic mental health and addiction issues. We know that post-COVID, our kids are suffering record rates of anxiety. And yet, when we took our kids to the ball field the other day, they weren't just selling beer, they were selling vodka spritzers. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, the thought of them selling in the stands hot dogs and vodka It just is
Yeah.
unbelievable. Of course, as we know, these days you routinely see hard liquor advertised on cable television because it's not precluded from that. But we never saw that kind of exposure.
Yeah.
And so the bottom line is the increased commercialization, advertising, and accessibility of addictive substances today puts parents like us on the defensive because it's a tough job protecting your kids in this world that we're living in today.
I agree with absolutely everything you just said. And that idea of parenting the gauntlet could just be the title, of what it's like these days to sit in this position of being responsible for these young people's lives or being their coach or helping them navigate this world that we live in. And I want to ask, and maybe even recognize that it's kind of scary to be a parent right now. How have you managed to help your kids understand the gauntlet and recognize, or maybe not at their younger ages? And has your experience in recovery informed that in any way?
Yes, I mean, as I said, I see my fellows in recovery in the obit sections of the local
Yeah,
newspaper every day. So this is not anything that I take lightly because
right,
this is a fatal illness.
right,
This is a fatal illness. This doubles the amount of people we lost during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And you know what our country did in the light of that. We're losing 2 times that amount every year, and we're like our
yeah,
heads are in the sand. We're in total denial as a nation. If we weren't in denial, we would be doing more about this. We wouldn't be saying, "Oh, let's commercialize a new addiction for-profit industry." We wouldn't be looking the other way on the impact of technology. We wouldn't be ignoring the impact of all of the online gaming, which
right.
frankly, gambling is a big precursor. So when I was little, my dad used to ask me to go help set the fireplace during the wintertime. And he said, Patrick, go out there and get some kindling. And so I go out there and I get that little kindling wood and I get the newspaper, I get it all under the big logs, and then we'd light the fire. Today, we have loads of kindling. The kindling in our kids' brains are all of these kind of addictive stimulants that wire their brains for addiction. So when you've got so much going on around your child with technology and everything else, kind of getting their brains primed for that dopamine response, which is what addiction's really about, it makes it harder down the line when they get the real chemical addictive substances to not have that brain really pre-wired for addiction. And of course, we know the most heritable illnesses are brain illnesses. We know that people have predisposition to cancer and cardiovascular disease, but we don't really appreciate that addiction and mental illness are also very heritable illnesses. And if we understood that, we would maybe be asking people in their pediatrician's office and educating people earlier, what's your family history? Because we want to make sure that we really identify the risk that people have and then plan around that risk. I know our kids are really at risk because genetically, both Amy's family and my own, they have a real predetermination to having these illnesses. We want to make sure we don't add to that by exposing them. So we try to educate them about all of that.
So, yeah, I don't think people understand how hereditary this is. And I too have massive amounts of addiction in my family. And it's one of the reasons I do this work as well. And I'd love to talk to you more about that. But first, let me ask you, are there any things that you do to keep the dopamine hits low for your kids, to manage the dopamine hits so that they're not just always sensation seeking and or I don't know, just feeling connected to life without the massive dopamine.
Well,
Anything?
we don't outlaw hugging and
Yeah.
kissing and snuggling.
Awesome.
We,
Right?
Those are good dopamine hits, that reinforcement, like that helps sustain them if they do get challenged in their life.
That's great.
Yeah, I think some of the things are obviously monitoring the social media use and technology in general. Our kids do have devices, and we really have tried to minimize that to kind of when we're traveling. That's something for the airplane ride, and it keeps it novel so that they're using it, but it's not an everyday. We have kind of that school night, we're not on devices, we're not watching TV. Our 15-year-old already has a phone, and I take it at bedtime just because we know how important sleep is. And I would say that has not been a solution. Just to be very honest with you, it's still a conversation and argument all the time. And we waited until our oldest was a teenager to even give her a phone because we were trying to kind of push it off as long as possible to develop other habits and interests as a way of managing time. And yet, as soon as you get that device, it is very addictive. I was doing a school visit yesterday, and one of the teenagers there said that she had decided not to go on social media anymore. And it had been 2 years. And she talked about it in the same way Patrick talks about his sobriety date. She said, "It's
Yeah.
been 2 years. I remember the day that I decided I wouldn't use social media anymore. And it was really important. It was to protect myself from what I was experiencing online." So it was interesting in her framing. I really took note of that because she kind of talked about it in the same way he would talk about his recovery. And so social media is one piece, technology just in general is something that we talk about, but we do talk about the hereditary nature and, genetic predisposition. We say that all the time with our kids. Hey, this runs in our family. We have to be very careful, and we're trying to think about it a lot.
Awesome. So those are great suggestions. And I liked how you said in there too that it's not easy. These are still fights. And I wonder sometimes if parents get worried or disoriented when their kids start fighting. It almost feels like there's a point where they're your amazing children that are snuggly and wonderful. And then all of a sudden, they just push back with a vengeance on everything. And it's good to hear, not good to hear, but I think it's good for our listeners to know that that is so common.
So
Um,
common. Yeah.
I,
It's been, there's still a recognition. Like our teenager understands why spending time on her cell phone is troubling, what is happening to her brain, but it's still setting those boundaries. That's always painful, right? It's like none of us like to have those things laid out or constraints on our freedoms. And so we know it's worth it, and so we'll fight those fights and try and just keep that expectation of being present and being part of the family and being connected as a top priority. And so we reinforce it all the time and have looked for lots of opportunities to just put the phone away for as
yeah,
long as possible and know that that's just one piece. So the phone is not going to be the whole issue. We've got to talk about our own experiences and what that looks like, and know that they may not steer clear of this altogether themselves either, but at least we're modeling what it looks like to seek help, to be in recovery, to be committed to those things. And if our kids end up in a position where they're feeling like they want help, that they'll know that we're able to support them in that.
that is so great. I like the idea of expanding the concept of modeling. We're obviously very focused on drugs and alcohol on this podcast. And I would like to hear how you are modeling that in your family. But it does go much broader, doesn't it? It's modeling everything, how to be connected, like you said, in in time and space in the moment, not through a device. It's really great. Talk to us. Your kids are a little bit younger. Have you shared your use story with them? And then also, Amy, how you kind of support the recovery in the family, anything along those lines.
Well, first, let me just go back to that modeling, because that's
Yeah.
really the heart of what this podcast and your mission is. We all are familiar with the phrase that we all become our parents, right? Like it or not, we become our parents. And that's because the modeling that they do is imprinted in our brains. That's who we are closest to, how they act, the decisions they make, and so forth, become inculcated into our own view of ourselves and the world and so forth. So that's why parenting is so much, the software that goes into our kids' brains, and why what you're doing through work like this podcast is educating parents to understand how big a role they play in their child's development is so crucial. I remember a story in my family where my dad told me that when my uncle was elected president and he was hadn't been sworn in yet, he was over at his house down on Cape Cod with my grandfather. My cousin Caroline was crying and trying to get his attention. And of course, he was the president elect, right? He had other things to do. And my dad was there because he told me the story when his dad grabbed his son, who was then the president elect, and said, just understand at the end of the day, the most important job you'll ever have is being father. And so, I think that for us, we have to think that phones aren't just the problem of kids.
Right.
Phones are my problem and every adult's problem. We're all connected and, frankly, easily go down that rabbit hole of social media and technology. So, the way we use phone, the boundaries that we set for ourselves are also protecting our kids. So, I have to be intentional, which is why I'm grateful to be in recovery, because I go to meetings every day to constantly remind myself that I have to be conscious in my life. It sounds like an obvious thing for everyone to be conscious, but so many of us spend our lives on that wheel, spinning wheel, not aware of the world as it goes on around us because we're constantly in reactive mode,
Yeah.
right? We don't understand our default mode of thinking, how we react, as opposed to how do we consciously make decisions and don't just become victims of our environment. So I work on trying to be present with my children, which means that I know it's not right when my phone is blowing up for me to take my eyes off my kids.
Mm.
It's not to say that I'm always successful in that, but I am aware more than I would be if I weren't in recovery, that I need to put my phone away when I'm with my kids so that my kids, when they're with me, have my attention, because my attention on them fills them up. It gives them security. When you have parents that are distracted because of drugs and alcohol, because of other mental illnesses, or things like technology, that robs our children of the most precious thing that they get in life. And that's the love, security, and sense of place in the world they get from their parents' attention. So that's how my recovery, I believe, translates to my kids, is that if I'm in a stronger place, then my kids are going to be in a stronger place. So when I go for 12-step recovery, I'm going for myself, but I know that it'll pay huge dividends for my children, because I'm not only doing it so that I can be fully actualized in my own life, but I know that I'll be modeling a much more intentional behavior, not reactive behavior. And implicitly, that is going to inculcate itself in my child, because these children are going to grow up understanding that life isn't just about reacting to everything, it's about being intentional. I think so much is nuanced, but it's so powerful if you have that modeled. And the only reason I can talk about this stuff is because I'm in active recovery, which means I'm constantly challenging myself to look at the barriers that separate me from my ability to understand everything that's going on around me and how I respond to those things.
That's fantastic. So I would love to know, Amy, your reaction to all that and how you feel like the recovery and both Patrick's and then your own family's history. How do you use it to your advantage in your family? How do you support it inside your family? Just any things, thoughts along those lines.
Yeah, I think when I met Patrick, one of the most attractive things about him was that it was not a finished picture, and that's really the thing that he shows our kids is that you're never done. We're a constant work in progress, and that he's always willing to do the work. So he's showing that all the time. Not that he is right, not that we're perfect, but that he is striving for that balance and does all of these different things.
I love that idea of life being a work in progress. And I just really think that's empowering for parents to look at life that way. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yep. When Patrick first talked about his recovery, he said, meetings and exercise are essential to my health. So just like if I had another disease and these were the medications and things that I need to stay healthy. And so I took that very much to heart. And he had a routine that he stuck with every day. And, that means that sometimes we have to really figure out how to juggle rides to things. But as he's gotten further into his journey, he also has become a little bit more flexible. So he's become more of a partner in helping to figure that out. That maybe in the beginning, 10 years ago, it was like, I have to do it this order at this time. And he was very rigid about it. And I understood that and was agreeable to that. But then as we expanded and we had 5 kids, some of that had to get a little bit more flexible. So now he may say, oh, Nellie's got a softball game in Linwood and there's a meeting in Linwood at that time. I can drive her, drop her off, catch some of the game if you can meet me there and pick her up later and we'll work it out. So being able to work together in that way and support each other has been really helpful. And then it transcends our family of just our kids to the impact that I've seen it have on our expanded family. So for example, I grew up as a child of an alcoholic, and to see how Patrick's consistency in his journey has impacted my own parents and their experience just because they've watched him and been in proximity to that has changed their dynamic and their health and journey. So it's really the modeling doesn't just happen with your kids, but it could happen with siblings, with parents in a way that I didn't think that at 76 years old, my dad would stop drinking.
And and he did.
And he did. That was not something I ever expected. I had no expectation of that happening. It was just, this is the reality. And so it was a decade, more than a decade of being around and seeing a new normal. I think being exposed to what that looks like and that that's okay too. He kind of grew up in a time where it was like, this is just what men do. We all have a beer. And then he has a lot of respect for Patrick. So to watch Patrick model a different normal, I think impacted his thinking on what was okay and that this could be achievable. And so that was really fantastic for our whole family to have that kind of
I,
new relationship.
I yeah, I'm kind of really taken by that story for so many reasons. The fact that just older generations can stop drinking and entertain that is remarkable. And knowing older generations that drink and didn't believe that was possible myself, hearing that story is really inspiring. I also think that's a story that says we all need to show up in our most authentic selves because we don't know what kind of impact we're going to have. I'm sure, Patrick, your recovery never intended to transform anyone else's life because I think we're supposed to let go of those expectations, but just being as authentic as you can is going to ripple out, and you never know where that's going to land. I wonder, the idea that the modeling goes out beyond your family, are you able to employ any of your family in your efforts to model with your kids? Can you commission aunts and uncles to be with you on this no use journey, at least in front of your kids? Or, are family dynamics hard to manage? And just how do you handle that?
Well, let me first say that I am blessed that my spouse has been so supportive of me and my recovery. And it is obviously a family illness when you have an active alcoholic, someone who's struggling with the disease of alcoholism and addiction, that impacts the whole family. But if the family is behind as a whole around recovery, then that spreads itself in a positive way throughout the family. And so Amy was doing this not only because of her love for me, but I think because she recognized coming from her own family what an impact it has if one member of the family isn't at their optimal. And that's the way we look at it. We all want to support each other because we're all impacted by each other. And it's not a one man band here. We have to do this together. So I know a lot of my friends in recovery who don't have it like I have it, where they have a spouse that's so in it with them in recovery. And it's a lot bigger challenge for them. I'm fortunate I don't have that challenge. I'll also say my kids have been incredibly valuable to me in my recovery because we talk about alcoholism. I, self, and me is how we refer to that in recovery. It's a very self centered illness. And my kids are like my 911 force because
Mm-hmm.
they're like kicking down the doors and dragging me out and dragging me out of myself. And that is a real win for me, that my children are helping me take me out of the worst neighborhood around, and that's the neighborhood between my two ears. I often say I'm like in a dark room developing negatives, and my kids open up the door and let me out and
Yeah.
see the light of day and the light of the spirit. So we need each other. That's the thing our country needs. We need it in our families and we need it in our communities. We thrive off of social interaction. One of the real components of having the illness of addiction is that you alienate yourself from everyone around you, because who wants to be around someone with the kind of illnesses that we have that are very antisocial illnesses? The
Yeah.
characteristics of someone with addiction and mental illness really put people off, which means it's mutually assured destruction. They don't want to be around you. You don't want to be around them. And then what makes the illnesses really pathologize is isolation. That's why COVID was such a impact on our nation's mental health, because when we became isolated as social people, we were detached in a way that was very unhealthy for our psyches. So building socialization, playing games in the family, going outside together in the environment, doing things together as a family, those things are so crucial. And having meals together, having meals where technology is not at the table. Simple things, but crucial things to building strong children. And of course, as I said, they build strong parents. So it always connects back.
I really like that idea. I think, some parents, I know I did a little bit, struggle with the role. Like, I'm the parent. I should know. I should be leading this whole thing called family. And the idea of letting our kids really form us and change us. In some ways it's just going to happen anyway, but you're recognizing that they could impact your life so positively if you let them engage with you in a certain way. addiction has the way of kind of forcing us into these things, but I think that is so powerful, and just a powerful message in general, to let our kids, yes, we still have to be the parents, and yes, we have to help with boundaries, and we have to do all these things, but thinking that that's just going to be a one-way street, I don't think it's true. I don't think it's a useful thing to bring into your parenting. I don't know. Something about that was really powerful to me.
Well, I want to protect who they are. They're just, as we all know, they're the most
Yeah.
important things in your life when you become a parent. And we want to protect them. And the
Yeah.
thing that could take them out, rob them of their brilliant, God given potential, is if they're hijacked by the disease of addiction.
Yeah.
And when you get hijacked and you're taken hostage because your brain is prisoner to this compulsion, you lose yourself. That's what's so frightening about these illnesses, is that people lose who they are.
Right.
And so we want to protect our kids to every extent possible. And so we give them all the nurturing and support and love. We try to be aware so that we can, be mindful of all our behaviors do to impact their own behaviors. And I just am so grateful for this podcast series and the messages that you're trying to disseminate, because we don't grow up with a toolkit and we don't have that handbook on how you're supposed to be in life, right?
Right.
And
Right.
thankfully for me, because I suffered from alcoholism and addiction, I had to get that handbook. It was called
Right.
12-Step Recovery. But it's been a godsend for me because it helps me not just stay free of drugs and alcohol, but it helps me focus on all the ways that my life isn't optimal because I have challenges like everyone else. Those toolkit to keep me from not drinking and drugging also is a toolkit to help me learn, pro-socialization and other behaviors that can be constructive rather than destructive in my life.
It's fantastic. This idea that we want to protect their beauty and their essence and everything that they're going to become in life, and this very real understanding today that adult addiction really is a childhood onset disease. I think the stat is 90% of adult addicts started using something before they were 18. So that's a really profound parenting kind of directive in helping our kids, I always say, navigate away from drugs and alcohol. This idea that we're going to keep them from using is probably a little idealistic, but helping them navigate away, being that prefrontal cortex that can set some boundaries. When I love the way you said your 15-year-old, she knows what all the problems are with the phone, but it's
Yeah.
the putting it down that is the boundary, that the prefrontal cortex just isn't there yet. And you need mom, you need dad to
And I would
step.
say, I mean, we think about access too. We don't have alcohol in our home. We don't have, you know, obviously we don't have drugs in our home, and we try not to have access to other things that we think are going to have a negative impact on their brains. And so that makes a difference. And
Yeah.
if we have, you asked about friends and family,
Yeah.
we have our extended family over for dinner on Sundays, and they come and it's, do you want water? Do you want iced tea? Do you want
Yeah.
sparkling water, lemonade? We've got a couple things. And everybody knows the drill, and they all come, and that's fine. And nobody thinks any different of it. And so while we can't necessarily keep kids from trying things, I can make it harder. I can
Yeah.
make sure it's not something that's right in our house. And I think about it in lots of ways. You think about, like, okay, what about cash? How are
Mhm.
looking at what summer jobs you're going to have, and how, because we both know all the things that we did, that teens do. And you go, okay, I want you to have a summer job. I
Yeah.
also am not sure I want you to have a lot of cash on hand. Let's think about what jobs you're going to have, and
Yeah.
can we set up something with direct deposit so we know how you're spending your money or saving your money? And we talk about saving money and why that's important and not having things around. with Patrick's medications, we keep them locked up.
Yeah.
And everything.
Yeah.
It's just locked aside from band-aids and
Right.
allergy, Claritin,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, or something like that. It's locked, and
Yeah.
those are just simple, have to do it because we just want to make it more
Yeah.
difficult. The longer we can put it out, the better our chances are for their outcomes.
Delayed onset of everything. The kind of the mantra. Delay the onset. Delay the initiation.
Yeah, they can make their minds up if they want to use, so long as it's after 25, right?
Exactly.
That's all.
We're
If
good.
they can make the choice, it's their choice. It's not their choice if it's
Yeah.
before 25,
Right.
really, because, obviously, as you point out, their brain isn't fully developed. I mean, their prefrontal cortex, which mediates decision making. Otherwise, it's all their amygdala, it's all that reactive. And
Right.
with kids today in reactive mode, because of lack of socialization, isolation, COVID, and anxiety in the toxic world that we're living in today, politically, emotionally, economically, it's just a really challenging time for kids to try to manage stress. They don't have the coping mechanisms. So we just said they don't get the handbook. They don't have the problem solving skills. They don't have the stress management skills. And frankly, everyone needs those skills. But our kids, especially in this world that they're growing up in, need them more than ever. So, it's not just keeping these other things away from them, it's how do we teach them? And Amy is just, as a former public school teacher, knows kids and development, really knows how to work through when they have a tantrum, when they have a meltdown. Like, how do they understand that? We have books that tell stories. The ice cream book, where it's the different scoops of ice cream, and then they all meld together. So one scoop, they get out of bed and they fall down. The other thing is their toy breaks, they miss school, or they get bullied. All of these things together kind of create a storm of emotions in these children, and then they react. So we read books that have these allegories so that they can start to understand why it is that they get angry, why they get sad. We talk about feelings. We have children's stories around feelings. So helping them identify all these emotions is really key to ultimately helping them learn the skills to manage these emotions.
I think also just normalizing that you're not always going to feel great. And
Mm.
sometimes you have
So
to sit,
powerful.
right? Sometimes you just have to sit in that and not feel great. And it's not always something that you need to just numb out
Right.
that feeling. I think there's a lot of times now that things are so convenient and it's
Mm.
so easy to escape
Mm.
discomfort, especially for young people. There's so many ways that they can escape discomfort that the feeling of struggling is not normalized. And that to be able to say struggling leads to growth and that you're going to get through this. And yeah, being a teenager is just miserable.
It
The
is.
some part of that is just miserable, and that's okay. That doesn't make something wrong with you that you're not feeling joyful about showing up to school every day. That's okay. So there's a little bit of that where we have to, I think, normalize that and know that while we want to approach everything with enthusiasm and we try to really have gratitude, we talk about gratitude a lot and look for those opportunities that, a little discomfort's okay too.
This has all just been so powerful, and getting to hear your parenting perspectives and addressing these difficult topics. It's really hard to be a parent today. It's relentless, is what I always say. There never stops, the stuff that they're encountering. And you add 2 kids and 3 kids and 5 kids, and it's a hard job. And I always want parents to not be deflated by that, and to just recognize how difficult it is. And you guys have said so many great things about it and shared so many great realities. I did want to ask real quick about what is sometimes called parenting peers. So basically, our parent friends, right? So lots of times it's the parents of your kids' best friends that you end up in relationship with. And any thoughts about, do you have those parenting peers in your life? Did they just show up kind of organically? Did you seek them out? And do you have any kind of conversations with them or shared goals with them about this is what we want for our kids and this is what we're going to try to achieve?
We have kind of different groups because our kids are all different ages. And it's
Yeah.
funny how you know some of the parents of your oldest kids best, or maybe there's a particular grade where the parents are a
Yeah.
tighter knit. So
Yes.
I would say because we have five, I've seen the variation in the parents as well. Now, I would say we're starting to get a little old for the parent group of our youngest
Right.
because we started this show a little late. So
Yeah.
we're not natural peers with our 4-year olds parent group, but I've got some buddies there too. And I I do share some of those same goals with my some of the friends. I think it happens a lot more with the moms. We'll walk together, we're planning the activities. I do a lot of the scheduling of the kids' sports and other activities. So
Mhm.
we share, like, oh, I'm signing them up for basketball. This is what's happening. And you get to see what people's values and priorities are.
Mhm.
And there's also times when we're a little bit left out of the parenting circle because we don't drink, because so much of socialization really centers around that. Whether it's kids' sporting events and people bring a cooler, or they're going to the beach and it's kind of a day drink situation where it's going to be an all day thing. There's times when we're not included, and we feel that, but it's been great to find some parents that we really connect with, and that doesn't mean that they also have to be sober or in recovery, but they have that same, just trying to cultivate kids' interests and keep them active and keep them connected. I think that's where we share a lot of the same values.
Yeah. I'm glad you shared that sometimes you're not invited. I have experienced that myself, and I would want our listeners to hear how okay that is,
Yeah.
and that we don't get invited to everything all the time anyway. So, the
Yeah,
fact
it
that
could
we
be for other reasons, but I chalk it up to that. So,
exactly.
yeah.
Um, and it is funny too. I don't know if you're seeing this in high school, but I think when kids get into high school, some parents get like catapulted back into their own high school experience and all kinds of, I have lots of friends who we were all on the same page, elementary, middle, and then we got to high school and they were not on that page anymore,
Yeah.
and it was just really interesting to think that there's even some parenting peer pressure out there that some parents feel, and
Yeah,
I don't
I
know how.
even see it within, like, I have brothers and we all have kids, and so even with like your own siblings and how they are raising their kids and you're raising your kids and what they're permissive about as far as their kids drinking or having friends over or being supervised or not supervised. There's variation within that, and different sensitivities. And so we're probably on the more extreme end of being sensitive to it, and other family members are not as sensitive, and some are
Yeah,
in the middle. But I think we've been able to navigate that pretty well and feel like everybody's got to find their own way with it.
yeah,
But knowing that, I think there's a little humility that helps us with that, in being able to say, we may do all these things and our kids are still going to have a tough road.
yeah,
So I don't know that what we're doing is going to necessarily keep them in this protective bubble. So what we're really trying to do is protect them as much as we can, but also guide them so that they will know where to turn if they
Yeah.
need it. And I think all the parents are in that same, even the ones that have a little bit different version of supervision are
Right.
on board with that same approach.
I like that. I love how you said that. And there is a humility in parenting in general, right? I mean, we just may all mess it up, just
A lot of guilt, a
just
lot of shame, a lot of worry at
worry.
night. This is a lot of time next to each other at night where we're talking over how the day went and
Yeah.
sharing those concerns and feeling bad about how something turned out or a reaction that we had. But I think one of the things is that at least we're reflecting on it. That's
Yeah.
something, right?
That is something.
There's, I feel like I get credit for the effort, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, I so agree. It's so easy not to look at it, right? And not to assess. Completely agree. And through that reflection, thinking about, okay, well, what are we doing tomorrow? And do we really need to be worried about this? And it's nice to have a partner to get to run through that with. And I think we can find those partners anywhere, no matter what our parenting situation is. And I hope parents do. I mean, even if you're a single parent, that's one thing. You can even be a married parent or co-parenting or whatever the structure is, and not be on the same page about things, not be wanting to talk about certain things. So finding outlets for that reflection is probably really important, no matter
I
where.
really leaned into my parents and my best friend when I had gotten divorced. My oldest child was just 2, and
Mhm.
I was really unhappy. And
Yeah.
I knew I could not be everything Harper needed at that moment. And so it was like, all right, I am trying to put a smile on my face. I'm trying to be fun and
Mhm.
bright, and I'm having a hard time. So they stepped in, and I just made sure I had people around that
Mm.
also could, because I was a little stuck within myself.
Sure.
So there were other people to kind of help support and give that attention and really kind of the joy that I didn't feel like was in
Ah,
me, but I knew she deserved and needed as a 2-year-old. Like, you're so fun. You want to be happy and
yeah.
playful. And I'm not feeling very playful. So being able to bring some other people around that added that was the best I could do at that moment. And so they played my mom played, read, did all kinds of things. And I was there. I was like a little bit of an observer for about
Yeah.
6 months in there. And,
Your instinctive nature, or the instinct to do that, is so powerful. And I think that's also a great message for this podcast. Parenting, again, like we said, it's hard. And there are going to be moments where we just can't do it. And for whatever reasons, and really asking for help in those moments, which is a theme we've kind of talked about this whole time, right? We're social, we're connected, we can't do it by ourselves. And finding people that can help us is so important. It's really powerful. There was something else I wanted to ask you guys about. This has been so good. One question that I could ask is how you think parents should think about a couple things. And those things would be that intersection between mental health and addiction, which I think is unclear for some folks. And then also marijuana legalization. What should we be thinking about that? Most of my parent friends are not thinking about it at all. So, any thoughts along either of those paths?
Well, I had the honor when I was in Congress of writing the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which basically says that insurance companies can no longer discriminate against illnesses of the brain, that they need to cover illnesses of the brain the way they would cover any other illness of the body. And they need to cover it across the whole spectrum, primary, secondary, tertiary levels of care. As we know, when it comes to mental illness and addiction, we don't often come and treat them until they're stage 4 illnesses, and we have to wait till it's a crisis. We don't do that with cancer these days. We screen early. And because we know that people have the best chance of recovery if that intervention is an early intervention, why don't we apply that to our approaches to mental illness and addiction. And if that's the case, the best intervention is to make sure our kids don't get into trouble in the first place. And we know increasing access to alcohol, increasing access to cigarettes, vapes, marijuana, social media, you name it, is going to increase the number of people who become addicted to it. It's just, we know there's a certain population that has a predisposition to addiction. And the more you fire that up, the more they end up in jeopardy of having addiction. So if we don't want the demand to be as high as it is, tragically, in this country right now, for mental health and addiction, we need to tackle this not just by getting insurance companies to pay for treatment, which is what I've spent my life doing through the Kennedy Forum, but we also have to go upstream and do what Amy's trying to do through her work with the National Governors Association. And that is, how do we do policies to make sure our education system actually educates kids in skill development, how to cope, how to manage skills, problem solving, coping mechanism skills. And then at the same time, we've got to reduce, as I said, the gauntlet that these kids have to run through, where they are having all the addictive industries kind of target them and put them at risk for these because they're trying to get consumers. Because when you have the problem that we saw with Purdue Pharma and the opioid manufacturers, they corrupted the whole system because there was so much money to be made by addiction for profit. We saw that in tobacco. We've seen that in alcohol. There's 4 times the number of people who die of alcohol-related illnesses than are being killed, as we know, from the record overdoses that are a result of fentanyl, which we talk about all the time. Take that and multiply it 4 times. That's how many people every year are dying from alcoholism. We never talk about it because alcohol is so accepted. But it's important for us to have eyes on that. And so why would we want to repeat the mistakes of the past where we unleashed this powerful industry that only prints money if they get more people to use their product? I just think inherently that's bad decision making. So I'm a policy maker in that respect. We have parents all across the country who are joining this fight, even though it's kind of a freight train to commercialize a new addiction for profit, a new big tobacco. But we're doing what we can to stop it. And in the process, our kids are learning from our efforts. I mean, Amy and I both testified at our local community against zoning of any pot shop in our neighborhood. We don't want our kids walking around a Starbucks, a pot shop where they're selling elixirs and gummy bears and edibles. These are the brownies infused with THC. But unfortunately, minority communities, this is where all the pot shops are going. And tragically, the most vulnerable people in our society are often the ones who have to contend with these addiction for profit industries more than anyone else. So I think we need to decriminalize and stop sending people to jail because of a public health crisis of mental illness and addiction, which is unfortunately what our criminal justice system has become. Incarcerating people with mental illness, incarcerating people with addiction. But that doesn't mean we conflate a for-profit commercialization of marijuana as the answer. So we have to be really mindful. And our kids came with us to the town council meeting when we testified against that zoning.
More modeling, right? I mean, just this is what we believe, and come with us as we express those beliefs in the community. That is crazy.
And, I'm very fortunate with my uncle starting the Green Berets. President Kennedy, wore the wearing of the Green Berets. So I have friends who are Green Berets. And I always tell my kids when they're around that what makes a special forces operator so special is their mental health. Because they're all strong in the military. They all have got great physiques. Anyone who can pass a military test of any kind. And my hat's off to them. But what makes a Green Beret or special forces is their ability to manage the psychological environment, to the stress of being put in these foreign places with all kinds of stressors. And that's what they train for. And I always tell people the Green Berets have more mental health services than any other branch of the service. And it's not because they're weak. It's because our military has figured out that for them to be strong, They need the mental fortitude and the mental skills to fight in a very toxic and stressful environment. So that's what I want my kids to have. I want them to have what the Green Berets have. I want them to have the skills to navigate a very stressful world so they can come out through the other side healthy and intact. And I think as stewards of the future, because we're not just parents to our own kids, we're parents to other kids because we're all in this together as Americans. We need to protect our kids. Never have we seen the expansion of anxiety and depression and addiction taking more young people's lives ever in the history of this country than what we're seeing today. That's why I'm so grateful to you to put this podcast together so that all parents can know that we've got a big challenge on our hands and we have to fight it at every level, like as Amy said, just on the personal level in our own households, but we also have to fight this fight kind of in our country as well, because all of us have to come together to help our kids live their strongest and best lives.
Okay. I am kind of an emotional person anyway, but so much of what we talked about today is really hitting me. It's just so powerful. And there is so much at risk. And we do all have the opportunity to participate and help and change. And everything you both have said today has been so useful on that journey. And I just can't thank you enough for being here and sharing with us and bringing yourselves as parents to our listeners and letting them really hear what it's like and what are the things you're thinking about and how are you proceeding. I just hope everyone finds it useful. I know I have, and I'm just so grateful. So
Well, we're so grateful to you. And, both my parents suffered tremendously and my dad, tremendous trauma, but he got one thing really right with me. And that's that he held me tight, kissed me all the time, even as an adult. And I can tell you one piece of advice I have for every parent, there's no substitute than holding your kids tight, close to you, so that they know, even if the words aren't right, our actions speak so much more to those children that we love them and we've got their back.
So I just can't thank you both enough. This has been fantastic and really, I think, is going to be a useful podcast for all of our listeners. So we appreciate it.
Thank you, Debbie, for having us on. This has been a great experience, and we really appreciate what you're doing.
And appreciate you, Debbie. I mean, it takes everybody stepping up to try to spread the word, and you're doing your part. It's all of our job to do our part.
Thank you. Wow, I really appreciate that. I want to remind listeners the Talk They Hear You materials, including this podcast, can be found on the Talk They Hear You website, which is talktheyhearyou.samhsa.gov. Talk They Hear You, all spelled out, no spaces, .samhsa, which is SAMHSA.gov. Please share this site and this podcast with your friends. The more we can be in conversation with each other, the better for everyone, especially our kids. Lastly, we would like to hear from you. Would you like to be on our show? Do you have stories to share or tips or techniques that have worked or not worked for you as a parent? Do you have questions for us or any feedback on topics or improvements of any kind? We know that your input will help us design the most useful interviews possible. Please contact us at WhatParentsAreSaying@gmail.com for any of this. Again, all spelled out, WhatParentsAreSaying@gmail.com. This podcast is brought to you by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Talk They Hear You is a national prevention campaign that aims to help parents and caregivers talk with their kids about the dangers and risks of underage drinking and other drug use. As a reminder, the views expressed here are not necessarily those of SAMHSA or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.